Hey, thanks so much for listening to the Ridge Community Church podcast. My name is John. I'm one of the pastors on staff at the Ridge, and our vision is to bring the hope of Jesus into every home. So as a piece of that, our goal each week is to bring you something that's hopeful and helpful. So subscribe to this podcast to make sure you don't miss any hopeful and helpful conversations.
Hey everyone, and thanks for listening to this episode of the Ridge Community Church podcast. If you find today's episode hopeful and helpful, then please follow or subscribe, and then rate and review so that more people can find the conversation. Today's episode is the first part of my conversation with licensed professional counselor, Ryan Worley. I asked Ryan if he would be willing to talk about shame and how we deal with it. Shame is a really complex thing that so many people struggle with, and so we decided to have this be a two-part conversation. In the first part of the conversation, Ryan's going to share what shame is, how it's different from guilt, and how it impacts us and our relationships. This is part one of my conversation with Ryan. Well, hi, Ryan. Thanks for coming on to the Ridge podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
So you've had a very full career, lots of different stuff that you've had the opportunity to do, college athlete, missionary training, working with a college as an advisor, and as a counselor as well. Would you mind maybe just sharing a little bit about yourself, Ryan, and what you do now?
Yeah. So you're spot on. I've had a number of different experiences that I feel very fortunate and blessed to have experienced. And, you know, if I had to sum it up in a theme of kind of what my life has looked like post high school is basically intentionally working with people. And yeah, that's taken a number of different avenues throughout the course of my life. As you said, I've worked in the mission field as a missionary. My wife and I were missionaries for about 15 plus years. I've done a lot of church and parachurch stuff with people. But yeah, currently working with people in an intentional way has led me is into the field of professional counseling. And so what my roles look like right now is that I am the director of behavioral health at James Place, which is a local ministry of Elmbrook Church. And that's been going since I believe they founded James Place in 2007, originally in downtown Waukesha. And it's branched out. There's about 5 or 6 different locations that James Place is throughout the metro Milwaukee area. And I have the opportunity to use interns that are in their master's programs for counseling as a way to offer cost-free or free of cost, however you want to say that, services to people who need mental health services, whether that's low-income families, or we serve a lot of the homeless population in Waukesha as well. And so I have the opportunity to work with supervisors that oversee our interns, as well as I overseeing our interns, and just helping to meet people's needs in the Waukesha area, and then other places too. But Waukesha is really the primary place that our interns meet those needs right now. We're hoping to branch out into some other areas of Milwaukee, and we do have some things in the pipeline, but just timing and everything. We're getting there slowly but surely. So that's one role I have that takes up about 20 hours of my week. And then I'm also a therapist at New Life Resources, where I meet with all sorts of people. I think my youngest client right now is 6 years old. To my oldest client I was meeting with was probably, I think, in the late 60s. And so a whole range of people. I work with individuals, couples, families. I pretty much will not do every scenario, but I try to have a variety of different things that I'm working with, and I just like that. It just adds flavor to my life and to my day. And so, I try to meet people where they're at in that way and help them move forward in the way that they feel God is leading them. And then I also do the intakes at New Life Resources as well. So if someone calls into New Life and they want to become a client, or they were a historic client that had disengaged and are trying to reconnect with the clinic, then they'll inevitably talk with me at some point in that process. And so I have the ability to kind of talk with people in that capacity and find out what they need and connect them to one of our therapists, so they can receive the services that they're requesting. And so that's pretty much everything that I do right now. There's some other odd stuff, but those are the primary things in my professional life.
I mean, that sounds like enough to fill about 4 different calendars. So it makes sense.
Yeah. There's a lot going on for sure.
I'm curious, your time as a missionary, your time working with like college students, your time in ministry or in the missionary field, I'm sure you have a lot of times where you were kind of like an unofficial counselor where you're talking people through things and you're helping people deal with some of the scenarios they're facing. How has your perspective on guiding people through those kind of challenges changed as you've become a mental health professional?
Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah, it's definitely, it's just wired into me. It's always has been. I even remember this in high school, just meeting with people kind of in a one-on-one capacity. And so, a lot of what you're doing in those, or a lot of what I was doing in those early years was just kind of listening and kind of being there for people, kind of, trying to be the hands and feet of Jesus to people as best as you can be. And obviously, as you grow and learn and have more experience, like you can kind of polish up your approach to how you do that. But I think where my degree in clinical mental health counseling has really aided me is helping me to better understand the biological nature of how God has created us. I think that's something that, we as Christians often take for granted, is that we forget that we're biological beings that are living in a sin-cursed world, and our bodies experience those same sorts of things. And so whether it's deficiencies in dopamine or serotonin or other chemicals in our brain that lead to maladaptive behaviors, we just have to recognize that, right? And yes, Jesus and God are powerful and they can do anything that they want, but that doesn't mean that they supersede or suspend, the physical laws of where we live right now, right? And so a lot of what has aided me is better understanding just neurology and just how we function, how we create habits, how our brains work, just because that aids me more in an empathetic way to be able to sit with people and help them normalize their experience to the extent that, like, hey, what you're experiencing is in many ways normal, and it's just a result of the fall. There's things that we can do about it. There's choices that you can definitely make, but you don't have to allow your faith to crumble because you're facing these challenges, right? And I think a lot of people come into it who have strong Christian backgrounds. Unfortunately, they come into it thinking that maybe my faith isn't strong enough, or maybe I didn't do the right things. And it's like, no, that's often not the case, right? We just live in a world in which there is destruction because of sin, and we live with the effects of that. Just like somebody who is diabetic, they just can't produce the insulin that they need, so they have to take a shot. Sometimes we need help in order to function and thrive in this world, and that ultimately is to the glory of God. And there's a lot of things that we can use to get to a better, healthy, functioning place. And definitely faith is part of it. Scripture most definitely is another part of that. Approaching God and crying out to Him, definitely. But there's a lot of other options, and I think that's where my training in professional counseling has aided me. It just helps me to see a more holistic and rounded way of approaching life that helps people realize that it's just normal. We live in a fallen world, and there's not much we can do about that at this point.
Yeah. That feels like such a healthy and practical way to go through it as well, right? Where, you almost can use like a work analogy, right? Where you can pray for crops to grow, we'll say, but if you don't plant and water, and so do the planting and watering, and that, I think in a lot of ways is those practical tools that you can apply.
Most definitely. Yeah, most definitely.
Yeah, so I want to kind of hone in on one particular concept today, and that's the idea of shame. I think shame is really important to talk about. One way, because I feel like it is like a kind of a hidden emotion, or like a hidden thing that happens, because it kind of hide behind like other traits that people maybe more commonly will like try to tackle, like anger or things like that.
Yeah,
but it's super common, right?
Most definitely. Like, we all at varying levels experience, often in this discussion of shame, they'll be paired with shame and guilt. And that's by design. Like, those two kind of function together in a lot of different ways. But yeah, most definitely we all at varying levels experience shame and guilt in our lives. And we all have certain resources that help us maybe not to become as shameful or guilt-ridden, to the point where it's maladaptive or it malfunctions and causes us problems. Whereas some people are more susceptible to maybe those areas where shame really takes a hold of them and grips them and, creates a lot of havoc in their lives. But yeah, this experience of shame and guilt in our world is definitely something that we all, for the most part, experience, at varying levels, for sure.
How would you typically define shame? And maybe how does that differentiate from, like you mentioned, the pairing of shame and guilt?
Yeah. So there was several different definitions that I took, because I think it's good just to get kind of a well-rounded perspective of what it is. And so one definition would, say that shame is a feeling of embarrassment or humiliation that arises from the perception of having done something dishonorable, immoral, or improper. So they're embedded in that definition. You see that idea of like, okay, some kind of code has been broken, and due to that code, right, there's this emotional reaction of embarrassment or humiliation. Another one highly defines it as a highly unpleasant, self-conscious emotion arising from the sense of there being something dishonorable, immodest, or indecorous in one's own conduct or circumstance. So once again, that idea that like, okay, I've crossed a threshold, a boundary that I shouldn't have gone past, and it just that result of emotion spurs up or props up. Another one, it starts to get into kind of the area that a lot more people are getting into when it comes to this idea of shame, a self-conscious emotion arising from the sense that something is fundamentally wrong about oneself, or that personalized judgment that I am bad. And so this is where you start to get into the distinction between guilt and shame that a lot of researchers will make, whereas, guilt is definitely a status, right? Like, and this is where, man, there's a fine line. I don't even know that there's a consensus on exactly how we work this out. I mean, there's definitely a more thorough line, but like guilt for most of the human experience has been seen as a status, right? Like you're either guilty or you're not guilty, you're innocent or you're not innocent. And it was just a status. Then, in that mindset, we'd keep guilt in the status form, and then we'd use shame as the verbiage to explain the emotions surrounding when one is guilty and what results from that, right? But, modern research often looks at this idea that, shame is totally this inwardly looking focus of oneself, of seeing oneself as bad, not doing something bad, I am bad. And so look at this kind of this distortion of this emotion that it basically attacks the self and creates a lot of havoc with just your internal ability to cope, your internal ability to connect with other people, because shame at its core, at its foundation, is a result of disconnection. And as Dr. Green at our clinic often says, as humans, we're designed to connect, we're designed to know and be known, to love and be loved. And shame and guilt have that ability to disconnect and create that lack of connection that we all strive for. And then when it becomes problematic, we see a lot of different resulting behaviors and mindsets that erupt out of shame not being dealt with properly. The last definition is actually Dr. Green's that comes from his book, Guilt and Shame. And he would define it as a subjective emotional response that can leave one feeling numb or painful following a perceived disconnection. And so, you can go in a lot of different ways with that definition, but, that's a good idea of recognizing that, it is subjective, it's an emotional response. And it can leave you feeling a lot of different ways, but it is the result of a disconnection that has been experienced. And that disconnection can be with self, can be with other, can be with truth, it can be with God. There's a lot of different connection options that we have that we can feel disconnected from. But yeah, shame is the result of that crossing one's, boundary markers, whether that be moral or just personal, and, feeling that disconnection that arises because of that. And then a whole host of emotions can follow up with that.
Yeah, it seems like as you're just sharing that, like there's like almost a boundary where it starts to, where it becomes unhealthy. Not to say that shame is ever like necessarily a good thing, right? Obviously I wouldn't say that, but yeah. I mean, there's a kind of almost like a normal amount of guilt or shame that might accompany like a certain behavior that you do where you feel this shouldn't have done that, versus a like deep feeling of who you are and like your own feeling of like low self-worth. Is that kind of a fair distinguisher when it starts to become unhealthy?
Yeah. If I'm understanding you correctly, I think that is, and there definitely, I think in modern shame research, what you find is like you'll find some that say there's no redeemable quality to shame. It's all bad. And then you'll find others that say that, there are healthy functions that shame produces in one person, right? And when it becomes distorted, when it becomes jaded and out of proportion to what it was designed to do in us, you get that phenomenon of that, just that inwardly focusing, self that is self-loathing and attacking self, that inner critic, basically, like we talk about it, where, and guilt, this is where it becomes so interesting, because shame and guilt just are so kind of interconnected with how you move through it. But understanding the difference, I think understanding that, shame is the result of disconnection. Guilt is typically a status, so you're either guilty or you're not, you're innocent or you're not, can really help one not only differentiate between those two, but also how do we resolve these things in our lives as we move forward? Because ultimately we don't want shame to get to that point where, we moved from I did something bad to now I am bad. And that's kind of how Brene Brown is a big name when it comes to shame research and vulnerability. And that's the phrase that she'll use is, the difference that you can often think of with shame and guilt is that idea of I did something bad versus I am bad, and that's where unresolved shame or misplaced guilt, however you want to say it kind of goes, right? It goes from, I did something wrong to now I am wrong. I am bad, there can be a lot of stuff that comes from that.
And so what is the consequences of like kind of living with that shame without like processing and going through it? Like what might you see somebody that's battling shame, how might it affect their lives, their relationships, what they're going through?
Yeah, it's a good question. One of the things too that we have to realize is like, life and humans in particular are so complex, right? There are a number of different factors that can weigh into how somebody is. We love the idea of just being able to label something and make it clean and cut and stick it in its box and say it is this thing, right?
Easy to fix.
Yeah. We want the definable term so we have, we can figure out what the solution is to that. And so although some of these things I'm going to share, are definitely signs of, unresolved shame or shame that has become toxic in many ways, they can be signs of other stuff too. So, it isn't just like you take this list and you superimpose it on somebody and be like, you're dealing with shame.
Right.
The reality is most of us probably deal with shame on some level. In a sense, at a toxic level, to some degree throughout the course of our life, and how we handle that and deal with it is really the critical thing. But people who present with complicated shame or shame that is kind of gone awry or is causing havoc, they're gonna, it's gonna be very easy for them to deny culpability. They're lashing out in anger is another phenomenon, blaming others, hostility, aggression, violence, bullying, low self-esteem, suicidal ideation. There's definitely, as you were saying, there's definitely interference with establishing and maintaining healthy interpersonal relationships, primarily because when there's a lot of shame present with the individual, there's just a lack of empathy for other because you're so inwardly focused. And then there's the anger component as well. And so lack of empathy and anger are kind of a poor recipe for having good interpersonal relationships. And then also kind of like we've already alluded to is, when shame is present in an individual who hasn't resolved it well, the cognitive and emotional resources and energy that they're using are not completely, but mostly directed inward. And that makes that ability to focus on others' perspectives, it just makes it really hard for them to be able to hold that, thus the empathy component, right? So all that energy is just so focused on that, shame causes us to disconnect, causes us to hide, to draw away, to avoid. And so, we're using all of that energy to do those behaviors, thus creating this inability to empathize with another person. And then also the anger component, like we were saying. And then there's a lot of research behind like psychological disorders associated with heavy shame and shame that's unresolved. And that could be stuff like addiction, depression, eating disorders. I mean, there's a lot of different things that you could add to that list. But it's safe to say that empirical findings, have confirmed that frequent experiences of shame contribute to individual vulnerability to psychological distress, interpersonal shortcomings, and poor psychosocial outcomes due to the problematic behaviors that shame brings, in the wake of it, being in somebody's life.
And it's not just about the like topic that they feel shame about, right? That's like a holistic portion, right? So it's like if if there's issue A that I feel this shame about, maybe this thing that happened when I was a kid, whatever it is, you might still have actions on topics that are unrelated to that because you're spending so much like internal energy processing or having that shame. Is that fair? Like, so issues B, C, and D might still be met with some of that defensiveness or whatever because A has been dealt with. Is that fair?
Yeah. Shame has a tendency. So, as your brain codes stuff, and as your brain learns to predict stuff, because basically, so this is where like understanding the brain and how it functions and stuff. The brain is a massive prediction computer, basically what it's doing is it's taking all the sensory data that you're receiving through your five senses, and that's getting funneled up through your spinal cord into your brainstem, into your brain. It's running prediction models on, threat assessment basically and what's going on. And so when you start to have variables that are paired with shame, because shame's basic function is to inhibit and shut down. When you have shame being paired to these variables, you can start to experience a lot of subsequent inhibiting and shutting down of other situations because those variables may be similar or present. And so the shame gets provoked, and then it starts to kind of like leaven's a whole lump, right? Like, not that shame's going to completely infiltrate your whole system. It has the potential if you don't resolve it, but it just starts to kind of pair itself with a lot of different stuff that creates a lot of this inhibiting and shutting down. And so that's when you come across people who are very shame bound. It becomes very difficult for them to be vulnerable. And vulnerability is so necessary in connecting, but that shame is just pressing down. It's so intense before you get ready to share shame with somebody, right? It's the most intense it can be. And then it's not once you reveal that, once you share that power is lost. When it's exposed, when shame's exposed, the power is lost. That inhibition, that pushing down or shutting away, it like loses its power, right? And so, a lot of different elements of life can maybe not, maybe they weren't directly impacted by the original shame event, if you want to say it that way, but now are subsequently impacted by those variables because your brain operates so much on just outside your conscious awareness. Like there's just so much computing that your brain is doing that it becomes so easy for those variables to become corrupted, and then for other areas of your life to become impacted by shame, even though that wasn't the original event. And that's kind of how I understood your question. Did I answer it?
No, that was great. Okay. I'm curious. You kind of mentioned like shame events. How important is it to like identify the root cause of maybe a specific shame? Because I know that there can be so many, right? There can be your own things that you've done. There can be, childhood trauma that makes you internalize stuff. I know there's all different types of sources. Yeah. How valuable is it to like find those things, or is it more important to kind of learn how to holistically overcome change, if that makes sense?
Yeah. Part of the resolving of shame is definitely identifying, the source of shame. And so that source of shame could be internally driven. So like there's something that I did that internal or that, that source of shame could be external to, it could be something somebody else did, or it could just be a result of living in a sinful human world, that kind of natural shame that's just part of the human creation, right? And so understanding where the shame kind of originated from, like, do you have to get down to the nitty gritty of the details of where it originates from? Not necessarily, but like you have to be able to identify, okay, because what you have to do is you have to move into who's responsible for the disconnect, right? Is this something that I've done myself? And if it's something I've done myself, then it's something that I need to resolve within myself. If it's something that is done from outside of me, then, by somebody else, then I need to hold that other person responsible, and then go through some other steps. But that's how I get to resolving the shame. And if it's just that kind of that natural shame that is just part of creation because of sin being in the world, then, you can reconnect with God. You can turn to God for the acceptance of that thing and release it to God, and then move through steps as well. And so to answer your question, at some level, it does become important to be able to identify where the source of shame was, because that identifies okay, what are my next steps? But do you have to get down into the nitty gritty of all the details beyond the source of it and who is responsible? Not necessarily. That might become important as you get further down the road of maybe forgiveness work and stuff like that. But you just need to have a bearing on, okay, is this something I'm doing internally that I need to adjust to and resolve, or is this an external shame that's kind of being imposed upon me that I need to recognize and hold the other responsible for?
When you say external shame, what do you mean by that? Because I feel like internal shame, we kind of like, oh, okay, I did this thing and I feel shame about it, right? Versus an external shame. What does that look like?
Yeah, external shames are just those imposed shames that it's disconnection that is the result of somebody else. They did it, and so simple illustrations of that would be like somebody calling you a name or berating you or degrading you for no reason. You did. Yeah. There's no guilt. There's nothing wrong. You maybe how do they say that, the wrong place at the wrong time sort of phenomenon, or maybe you're just minding your own business and someone starts berating you and calling you stupid and idiot, you'll never amount to anything. Gotcha. Or a coach, those are those kind of imposed shame circumstances that, we often immediately internalize. And then the inner critic is just so good at taking any source material and superimposing it upon ourselves. It's fantastic at that. And so that's where really understanding, going back to, okay, where does this messaging come from, right? Like when I think that I'm such an idiot, I'm so stupid, and you have shame about this, that, or the other, where did this come from, and more often than not, that comes from that imposed shame of somebody belittling you and creating that shame that now you superimpose upon yourself, that now you have to deal with. You're dealing with internally, but you have to deal with and hold other responsible for the role that they played in that shame and let it go, but that's what we mean by imposed shame. Yeah.
Well, that was part one of my conversation with Ryan. And I think my takeaway from this part of the conversation is just how valuable it can be to identify areas where you might be experiencing shame in your life. Figuring out if it's an internal shame or an external shame can be super valuable to processing throughout it. Next week, we're going to release part 2 of our conversation where we're going to talk about the process of overcoming shame and how you can do that step by step. My encouragement to you is to use this week trying to identify if there are some areas of your life where you might be experiencing shame and where it's coming from. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Ridge Podcast, and make sure to follow and subscribe so that you don't miss any hopeful and helpful conversations.